Picture this: you step through the sandstone gateway of Fate Pasikri in the late 16th century, the once bustling capital of Emperor Akbar's empire. The air is dry, heavy with dust and the scent of rosewater and horse sweat. You're led past grand courtyards and marble terraces, until you reach a quieter section of the palace complex, one with no banners, no guards, no names on official maps. Here, the walls are higher. Windows are latticed with carved stone. You hear no voices, only the low rustle of silk and the occasional echo of sandals brushing against sandstone. You've entered the Zanana, the imperial harem. But this story isn't about the women. It's about the men who weren't allowed to be men. The Khwajasaras, eunuchs. And not just any eunuchs. These were castrated servants, often taken as children from conquered territories, converted, trained, and raised within the Mughal court to serve a very specific purpose. By the time of Akbar's rule, their presence was considered vital, not only to the functioning of the harem, but to the machinery of imperial power itself. You don't see them at first. They rarely appear in the grand portraits of court life. Chroniclers like Abu el-Fazl mention them only in passing. But they are there, behind every heavy curtain, stationed at every entrance to the women's quarters, holding the keys, controlling access, and watching, always watching. Their origins were violent. The Mughals had adopted the institution from earlier sultanates, particularly the Delhi Sultanate, where eunuchs had already become a familiar presence in elite spaces. Most were slaves, captured in war, bought from Central Asian or Abyssinian traders, castrated, either partially or fully, and sold at high prices for court service. The procedure was crude, often fatal. Those who survived were considered valuable property. Akbar institutionalized them. Under his administration, eunuchs were assigned clear titles, duties, and ranks. They were given salaries, land grants, even small military commands. They were no longer just passive attendants, they were active agents in court politics, especially in spaces where no other man could go. The Mughal harem wasn't just a place of seclusion. It was a center of diplomacy, finance, and familial intrigue. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of royal women lived inside: mothers, wives, concubines, daughters, widows. Each had their own suite, their own staff, their own ambitions. The eunuchs were their intermediaries. They controlled messages. They managed daily routines. They facilitated audiences. In many cases, they decided who would see the emperor, and when. By the reign of Shah Jahan, eunuchs had become so embedded in the harem structure that imperial orders often passed through them before reaching the outer court. In one record from the Shah Jahan Nama, a eunuch named Itiba Khan is noted as carrying sensitive documents between the Empress Mumtaz Mahal and her husband. He wasn't just a servant. He was a gatekeeper, both literal and political. And he wasn't alone. Other eunuchs, like Firoz Khan and Khwaja Bega, held titles such as Daroga-i-Harem, superintendent of the harem, commanding entire staffs of subordinate eunuchs and servants. Their responsibilities included security, finance, etiquette enforcement, and sometimes punishment. Inside the walls of the pleasure palaces, especially at Agra, Lahore, and later, Delhi, their control was near total. They kept records of menstrual cycles, pregnancies, illnesses. They monitored gifts from foreign envoys. They prevented gossip. And if a woman violated court protocol, say, by attempting to leave the harem without permission, it was often a eunuch who carried out the sentence. They were feared, respected, and completely invisible to the outside world. But they weren't just bureaucrats. Some became confidants, even companions. Letters from the period hint at deep, sometimes emotionally complex relationships between eunuchs and their royal mistresses. In the Jahangirnama, there's a mention of a eunuch named Hiranand, whose loyalty during court intrigues earned him a jeweled sword and a personal audience with the emperor. One Portuguese visitor in 1603 described eunuchs as more loyal than any general, more trusted than any brother. But that trust came at a price. Their identities were erased. They were not considered full men. They could not marry. They had no lineage. Their castration removed not only their reproductive capacity, but their legal personhood. In Islamic law, as practiced by the Mughals, a eunuch was classified ambiguously, neither male nor female. In practice, this meant they were often excluded from inheritance, from public religious roles, and from legal protections afforded to other court officials. And yet, they continued to rise. By the time of Aurangzeb, eunuchs were serving as governors of fortresses. Some commanded small units of cavalry. Others were put in charge of elite treasure vaults. The emperor's trust in them had become so complete that when Aurangzeb fell ill in 1705, the only people allowed near his sickbed were his chief physician, and a eunuch named Baghtawar. But despite their influence, they left few traces. No memoirs. No tombs with inscriptions. Their names appear only briefly in the margins of imperial histories, usually attached to the deeds of others. And when the empire began to fracture in the 18th century, so too did their legacy. The eunuch system was gradually abandoned. As the British gained control, they abolished the harem entirely. The buildings remained, empty shells of stone and marble, but the people who once maintained them were cast aside. Most died poor. Some were forced into begging. Others disappeared into anonymity. Their knowledge, their authority, and their secrets vanished with them. The records stopped. The rolls ended. But the silence remains. If this is your first time hearing the true story behind the eunuchs of the Mughal pleasure palaces, consider subscribing for more grounded historical investigations. Leave a comment with where you're watching from, and let us know what era you'd like to explore next. The fall wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal Empire began to fragment. Successors fought over succession. Regional governors, Nawabs, grew more autonomous. Marathas raided court centers. The British East India Company began interfering in local governance. In the middle of it all, the imperial harem still functioned. And the eunuchs, the Khwajasaras, still served. But their authority was no longer absolute. Under emperors like Bahadur Shah I and Farrukh Siyar, the harem was less centralized. Revenue from provincial lands was unreliable, and many eunuchs who had once enjoyed royal patronage now relied on the queen mothers or senior concubines for financial support. Their stipends shrank. Their titles carried less weight. Still, they endured, because their access remained critical. A 1713 report from a court chronicler mentions a eunuch named Sadiq Khan, who facilitated secret correspondence between the empress and her allies during a succession crisis. His actions helped install her favored candidate, at least temporarily. Sadiq was rewarded with robes of honor, but he was assassinated months later. No official inquiry was opened. His role was too sensitive. His status, too marginal. This was the contradiction at the heart of their existence. Eunuchs had enormous proximity to power, yet no protection under it. And outside the palace, society saw them differently. For the general public, eunuchs, especially those visibly castrated, were figures of superstition and ambiguity. In some regions, they were feared. In others, mocked. Children were told not to look them in the eye. Adult men avoided addressing them directly. Inside the palace, it was different. There, a eunuch's silence was valued more than a noble's oath. Some rose to power again. In the 1730s, during Muhammad Shah's reign, a eunuch named Javad Khan served as both Daroga-i-Harem and personal advisor to the emperor's favorite consort, Qudsiya Begum. According to court letters and Persian language records preserved in Delhi's state archives, Javad Khan oversaw revenue assignments, military promotions, and even punishment of nobles suspected of disloyalty. British observers were stunned. One East India Company agent wrote in 1737, "No man enters the harem without his permission. And no woman speaks to the emperor unless Javad allows it. He holds the key to the empire, not by sword, but by corridor." But power breeds enemies. When Javad Khan's influence became too public, too threatening, he was assassinated, stabbed by soldiers reportedly acting on orders from rival factions in the imperial court. His death marked the end of the last eunuch to hold significant political power in the Mughal court. After that, the Khwajasaras remained, but as relics. They continued their daily duties, guarding entrances, delivering messages, ensuring the privacy of the imperial women. But their political function had collapsed. Their titles remained ceremonial. Their voices, muted. Their numbers, reduced. By the 1750s, the Mughal Empire was a shadow. Delhi was looted by Nadir Shah of Persia in 1739. The peacock throne was gone. The treasury, emptied. The harem, traumatized. And the eunuchs. Their fates were undocumented. A few are mentioned in passing. A eunuch named Rustam Khan is listed in the salary registers of 1756, earning just 30 rupees a month, barely enough for food and housing. Another, Ibrahim Bakshi, appears in a legal dispute over land rights near Agra. The court denied his petition, citing his status as Mukannat, a non-person in matters of inheritance. This was their erasure. Not dramatic. Not violent. Just bureaucratic. And yet, in the architectural spaces they once dominated, their traces remained. The harem apartments in Red Fort, sealed off now, were designed for containment. High walls. Narrow passageways. Locked doors accessible only by eunuchs. Even today, the architectural historians who study these complexes admit there is little documentation about how these spaces functioned daily. Because the people who knew never wrote. There are no memoirs. No detailed letters. Unlike the male courtiers who filled manuscripts with poems and politics, the eunuchs left almost nothing. Whether by choice or restriction, their experiences exist only through others' records, and those are scarce. The British didn't help. When company officials took control of Delhi in the early 19th century, they dismantled the harem system entirely. The last vestiges of the imperial court were stripped of their former dignity. Eunuchs, who had once guarded emperor's secrets, were driven out. Some became beggars. Others joined itinerant groups that wandered from city to city. In time, many were absorbed into what is now broadly known as the Hydra community, a culturally distinct group of gender non-conforming people in South Asia. But the Khwajasaras of the Mughal palace were not simply early Hyjas. Their role had been different, state-sanctioned, administrative, militarized. And that role no longer existed. By the time the British formally dissolved the Mughal Empire in 1858, after the failed rebellion, the eunuchs were gone from court life. Red Fort's pleasure palaces were turned into British barracks. The harem apartments were locked or repurposed. And the records, such as they were, remained untouched in Imperial Persian, unread by most colonial administrators. The British saw no value in eunuch histories. Instead, they labeled them deviant, criminal. A 1871 report under the Criminal Tribes Act classified Hyjas and similar groups, including former eunuchs, as addicted to unnatural offenses requiring surveillance and control. They were fingerprinted, registered, forbidden from dancing in public or wearing women's clothing. Their identities, already fragile, were criminalized. But for centuries, these men had been central to the functioning of empire. Not kings, not warriors, but witnesses. They knew who entered the harem and when. They saw the emperor alone, in private, in moments of weakness and rage. They watched the succession struggles, the marriages, the betrayals. They carried letters that changed the fate of cities. They enforced rules no soldier dared question. And now, they were nameless, faceless, forgotten. By the mid-19th century, Delhi had changed beyond recognition. The British had not only dismantled the Mughal Empire, they had methodically erased the ecosystem that sustained it. What had once been a city of corridors, guarded silences, and discreet power brokers became a colonial outpost lined with civil offices and military cantonments. Inside Red Fort, the former harem quarters were gutted. Furnishings were stripped. Courtyards were paved over. The rooms where eunuchs once stood sentinel, outside the private chambers of empresses and concubines, were either boarded shut or reassigned as servant quarters for British officers. No inventory listed what became of the Khwajasaras still living in palace housing. There were no pensions. No transition plans. In colonial records, their existence vanishes almost overnight. Some tried to survive by pivoting to religious service. A few became caretakers at Sufi shrines or small mosques near the former harem gates, offering prayers in exchange for alms. Others merged into urban Hydra communities, forming enclaves on the outskirts of Delhi, Lucknow, and Hyderabad. But for those trained in court protocol, fluent in Persian, literate in administrative codes, familiar with imperial rhythms, this new life offered no dignity. They had spent decades learning how to serve an emperor, not how to beg before a magistrate. A British survey conducted in 1865 noted the appearance of former palace attendants of indeterminate sex near the northern walls of Agra Fort, dressed in mixed garb, offering blessings and curses for coin. The language is dismissive, but the detail is real. These were likely surviving eunuchs. Some colonial officers, puzzled by their presence, began to ask questions. One official, John Campbell, wrote in a personal letter from 1872. They claim to have served in the zenana of the late Mughal. They carry themselves with a peculiar dignity. I believe them. But the colonial system had no place for their stories. The Persian records that mentioned them, like the Ain-i Akbari, the Shah Jahan Nama, or the household account books, Barakatas, were archived but never translated in full. Even where eunuchs were named, British translators often omitted or misunderstood their roles, describing them vaguely as servants or harem stewards. This is why modern historians know so little. You're standing in an archive today, perhaps in Delhi, perhaps in Aligarh, reading fragile court documents. You find the name of a Khwajasara, Sayyid Bakhtawar, Daroga-i-Harem under Emperor Shah Alam II. His job included supervising 78 female attendants, tracking the daily expenses of the women's quarters, and ensuring no unauthorized man entered the private wing. He signed documents in Persian. He managed jewels, livestock, grain rations. But his life ends on paper with a simple line. Relieved of post in the 3rd year of reign. No further mention. No tomb. No biography. No portrait. This erasure wasn't accidental, it was systematic. As British rule expanded, they redefined gender and power according to Victorian norms. They viewed castration as mutilation, not service. They viewed gender variance as criminal, not customary. And they viewed the Mughal court's reliance on eunuchs as a symptom of Oriental decadence, something to be mocked and destroyed. By the 1890s, any mention of eunuchs in colonial documents was filtered through this lens. They were described as unnatural, impure, or degenerate. Their actual duties, the logistical, political, and emotional labor they had performed for centuries, were dismissed entirely. Even among Indians, memory shifted. As harem life disappeared, and public knowledge of its workings faded, the role of eunuchs morphed from high-ranking intermediaries to marginalized caricatures. The term Khwajasara lost its specific historical meaning and became conflated with Hydra identity. Entire generations grew up believing eunuchs had always lived on the streets, forgotten and pitted. But in places like Hyderabad, Bhopal, and Awadh, regions where princely courts survived under indirect British rule, fragments of the old system persisted. In Hyderabad's Nizamate, well into the early 20th century, there were still zenana guards and eunuch advisors. Some held small estates, carried ceremonial daggers, and wore insignia embroidered with court titles. In Bhopal, ruled by Muslim women from 1819 to 1926, eunuchs served in administrative roles within the female court structure, enforcing protocols during religious festivals and official ceremonies. These were remnants. Echoes. Not the same institution that had existed in the Mughal peak, but close enough to remind those who cared to look that this had once been a norm, not an aberration. But by 1947, with partition and the collapse of princely India, even those echoes fell silent. Modern India emerged with new priorities. Independence movements had no room for feudal structures, no sympathy for royal palaces, and no patience for the complexities of Khwajasaras. And so they were folded, again, into the background. Their stories lived on only in rumor, whispered tales of men who dressed in silk, held keys to secret gates, and vanished when the empire fell. But the facts remained in the records. Just obscured. In a weathered harem account book from 1659, held today in the National Archives, a eunuch named Khwaja Gul Muhammad is listed as receiving 2 saris of muslin, a silver inkwell, and a set of scrolls with imperial seals. The entry is precise. It confirms not only his status, but his trust. Another record from the reign of Akbar II describes a Khwajasara delivering a diamond necklace to a visiting dignitary on behalf of the Queen Mother. The eunuch is not named, but the log notes, given without speaking, returned with blessing. Even in silence, they moved the empire. By the time India entered the post-colonial era, the term Khwajasara had all but disappeared from public vocabulary. What had once referred to a formal, state-sanctioned rank within the Mughal court, a trusted intermediary between ruler and harem, was now blurred, linguistically and socially, with Hydra, a broader, heterogeneous community of gender non-conforming people historically recognized across South Asia. But the shift in terminology came with a shift in perception. The dignity, status, and institutional memory of the Khwajasaras were buried under layers of public misunderstanding. Now, they were seen as beggars, street performers, superstitious figures offering blessings at weddings and births in exchange for payment. Their long, quiet service to one of the most powerful empires in world history was almost entirely forgotten. Academic historians ignored them. Nationalist histories bypassed them. Museums excluded them. The palaces remained. In Delhi, Agra, Lahore, the old Mughal forts still stood. Tourists wandered through marble pavilions and red sandstone gates, guided by placards describing emperors, battles, and architectural feats. But none mentioned who once guarded the women's wings, who controlled the harem gates, who delivered the messages that shaped imperial alliances, who silently carried out punishment under royal orders. No statue, no memorial, no plaque. Only in rare private manuscripts, mostly preserved in personal libraries or forgotten boxes in Nawabi households, do their names surface at all. In a Risala memoir, compiled by a minor court scribe in Lucknow during the 1820s, a eunuch named Nawab Shamsuddin is mentioned as administering the women's salaries, maintaining palace security, and acting as the personal confidant to a begum who frequently negotiated with British officials. He is described not as a servant, but as a pillar of the household, a shadow in daylight, and the lamp in rooms where men could not go. Elsewhere, in the writings of the Bhopal princely court, references to eunuch staff persist into the 1920s. One document refers to the last of the Khwajasaras, a man named Kamaruddin, who served as chief steward to the Dowager Queen. When he died, he was buried not with the servants, but in a special enclosed tomb beside the Queen's garden chamber. No stone was placed above his grave. In oral history, fragments endure. Some families, descendants of palace cooks, musicians, or scribes, still pass down stories of the eunuchs who once brought order to the unseen world of royal women. One such account, recorded during a 1980s oral history project in Old Delhi, tells of a eunuch named Ghulam Nabi who served during the final days of Bahadur Shah Zafar. According to the account, when British troops stormed Delhi during the 1857 uprising, Ghulam Nabi destroyed sensitive harem records and helped smuggle several women out through the southern gates. The story cannot be verified. No British report mentions him. No grave bears his name. But it's consistent with the kind of duty the Khwajasaras had always performed, unrecognized, unseen, and absolute. That is the nature of their legacy, foundational but invisible. In modern India and Pakistan, public understanding of gender non-conforming individuals remains shaped by the legacy of colonial criminalization and social stigma. But slowly, very slowly, scholars and activists have begun to recover the deeper history. A few academic papers have traced the Khwajasaras' role in Persianate courts. Museums in Lucknow and Hyderabad have begun cataloguing harem-related artifacts that mention eunuchs. Documentary filmmakers have started interviewing descendants of palace staff who still remember the old ranks and rituals. But much of the institutional memory is gone. Even in the places where they once wielded power, inside the red walls of Agra Fort, the harem halls of Fate Pasikri, or the mirrored chambers of Lahore's Shish Mahal, nothing remains of their presence. No symbols. No preserved garments. No named portraits. Only silence. The same silence they once enforced. Because that was their function, to witness, to guard, to control, but never to be seen. And yet, the Mughal court could not have operated without them. The emperor's privacy, guaranteed by eunuchs. The harem's hierarchy, enforced by eunuchs. The security of imperial women, maintained by eunuchs. The passage of secret information, carried by eunuchs. They weren't just guards. They were the architecture of the harem itself. And for centuries, they shaped history from the shadows. Theirs was a life of contradictions, power without lineage, authority without freedom, influence without legacy. They belonged everywhere and nowhere. Central to empire, yet written out of its story. Until now. If you've made it this far, and this is the first time you've heard about the forgotten eunuchs of the Mughal pleasure palaces, like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. We recover these histories not to romanticize them, but to remember that power often hides behind those never allowed to speak. Because sometimes, the most important figures in a kingdom are the ones history tries hardest to erase.